He was the kind of man who never begged for anything until the night he stood in the doorway, voice shaking, and said, the one sentence no woman expects from her boss, pretend to be my wife at Christmas. But the real shock wasn't the request, it was the fear in his eyes. A fear so raw it didn't belong to a man who owned boardrooms, but to someone who'd been abandoned long before she ever knew him. And when she agreed, hoping to save her sister, she had no idea. She wasn't entering a family gathering. She was stepping into a haunted house of expectations, secrets, and a man who slept like he was begging someone not to leave him. Again. Because his final condition, the one he swore they must never break, might be the very thing she's already broken. Stay. This story doesn't begin with love, but it just might end with the truth they're both afraid to face. The office was nearly dark when Helen Brooks heard the words that stopped her fingers above the keyboard. The soft hum of the heating vents, the distant echo of an elevator shutting somewhere down the hall. Everything seemed to fall away as Jonathan Hale said, in a voice that sounded nothing like his usual controlled baritone, I need you to pretend to be my wife tomorrow. For a moment, she thought she'd imagined it. The winter light outside had faded into that blue-gray haze. Chicago knew too well, and after 12 hours at her desk, fatigue sometimes played tricks on her. She blinked at the reflection of the skyline on the office glass, then slowly turned in her chair. Jonathan stood there, framed by the doorway, his coat still on snow, melting in small, dark patches along the shoulders. He rarely stayed late, he rarely surprised her, and he never asked for anything personal. I'm sorry, she said, her voice catching a little. You need me to what? The man she'd worked beside for almost 9 years didn't move closer. He simply closed the door behind him as if the hallway might overhear. His usually unreadable face looked strained. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes, which she pretended not to know as well as she did, were deeper tonight. I wouldn't ask if it weren't necessary, he said quietly, but I need you there, with me. She pushed back her chair, steadying herself on the armrests. Jonathan, if this is some kind of, it isn't a joke. His tone cut softly through her disbelief. Not even close. The room felt colder than before. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around her, noticing suddenly how empty the entire floor was. Most employees had left hours ago to get home before the snowstorm. Only a few lights glowed along the corridor, enough to cast long shadows on the glass table between them. Helen tried to study his face without staring. Why me? He exhaled through his nose, a sound that almost resembled defeat. Because you understand me better than anyone else does. That didn't help. If anything, her pulse kicked harder. She knew his schedules, his work habits, the way he liked his reports stacked. She knew the warning signs of a bad day before anyone else did. But that wasn't understanding. That was survival in a demanding job. You have family, she said gently. You have friends, people closer to you than, that's just it. He finally stepped forward. The overhead light caught the faint stubble on his jaw, something she had never seen on him. My family expects me home for Christmas. As a married man, her breath tangled. Married, it's complicated. It always is, when you start with a sentence like that. A flicker of something like amusement brief gone in a heartbeat passed through his eyes. But it vanished under the weight of something heavier. He leaned a hand on the back of the chair opposite her. My family believes I've built a stable life, that I'm settled, that I'm not alone. His throat tightened around the last word in a way that unsettled her deeply. If I show up without someone by my side, someone I claim to love, they'll see through everything, and I can't let that happen this year. The phrasing bothered her. Everything. See through what? She stood slowly. Jonathan, if there's something wrong, you need to tell me before you ask me to walk into your family home pretending to be your wife. He didn't answer right away. She watched him turn toward the window, the city lights washing over his profile in sharp lines. He looked powerful as he always did, but there was tension beneath the surface, a tremor she'd never witnessed. I'm out of options, he said, finally, voice low. And I need someone I trust. The word trust cut deeper than it should have. She felt it settle in her chest, bringing with it memories of years spent anticipating his needs, smoothing the path in front of him, absorbing the frustrations he never showed the world. She trusted him with her livelihood. But whatever he was asking, this was different. This was stepping over a line she'd carefully respected. And none of them can know, he continued. No one in this building, no one at the estate, not even my siblings. It has to look real. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of that word settle on her shoulders. Real. How on earth was she supposed to make something like that believable? What exactly would I have to do, she whispered. His gaze met hers. He held it longer than he ever had in nearly a decade. "Just stand by me, stay close, and let them believe I wasn't lying when I said I'd found someone worth sharing my life with." Her heart stumbled at the phrasing, though she knew it wasn't meant for her. She was a stand-in, a convenient placeholder, a shield. Still, something flickered in his voice, something fragile. She stepped closer despite herself. "Jonathan, what are you not telling me?" He hesitated, jaw clenching. She could almost hear the war inside him, the instinct to stay silent versus the need to be understood. When he finally spoke, the admission sounded like it had torn itself out of him. "My family expects perfection," he murmured, "and I can't face them alone this year." Helen felt the truth in those words before she understood them. Something had broken inside this man, something private and heavy enough to drive him to her desk on a winter night, asking for a lie to save him. She opened her mouth to ask what could have shattered him so completely, but the question lodged in her throat, and the moment held its breath. She wasn't sure she was ready for the answer. The house felt different the moment Helen stepped inside, as if the warmth that used to greet her had thinned into something fragile. She closed the door behind her and stood for a long second in the entryway, listening to the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that reminded her how much she'd been carrying alone. A small lamp glowed in the living room, casting a soft amber circle over the couch where her sister usually rested. Tonight, Margaret wasn't there. The couch blanket was folded neatly, her favorite mug rinsed and placed upside down on the drying rack. Helen eased out of her shoes, the fatigue from the day settling into her bones like winter settling into the soil. She found her sister in the bedroom across the hall, propped up against pillows, flipping through a magazine she wasn't really reading. The dim yellow light softened the sharp lines of recovery on her face. "You're home late," Margaret said, offering a tired smile. "Traffic," Helen murmured, though they both knew that wasn't the truth. She hovered near the doorway for a moment before sitting at the edge of the bed. "How was your day?" "Oh, same as always." Margaret waved a weak hand. "Pain meds, physical therapy, doctor calls, nothing exciting." "Nothing exciting." Helen swallowed the ache rising in her throat. Her sister had always been the lively one, the one who filled holidays with recipes and stories, the one who held the family together after their parents passed. Seeing her reduced to this tight circle of rooms and medical routines hit Helen harder than she allowed herself to admit. "You should get some sleep," Margaret said, touching her arm. "You look worn out." "I'm fine. You haven't been fine in months." Helen didn't argue. She didn't have the strength for it. She pressed a gentle hand on her sister's knee before getting up. "I'll bring you some tea. Chamomile, that would be nice." In the kitchen, she filled the kettle and leaned against the counter, letting the cool granite touch the back of her hands. The stack of medical bills sat where she'd left it, half sorted, half dreaded. A new envelope had been slipped under the door earlier that day. She hadn't opened it yet. The white paper almost glowed under the kitchen light, as if daring her to look. She turned away from it, focusing on the steam beginning to rise from the kettle. The silence pressed close around her, thick with the familiar weight of responsibility. For years now, her life had narrowed into a pattern: work, caregiving, managing bills, holding things together with threads that kept fraying. She wasn't young anymore. She wasn't old either. She was somewhere in between, old enough to feel the ache in her back at night, young enough to still hope life had something left to offer. Yet most days, hope felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. When the tea was ready, she carried it back to Margaret and stayed until her breathing settled into that soft, steady rhythm of light sleep. Then she returned to the kitchen and finally picked up the envelope. Inside was a foreclosure warning. Not the first one, but this one had a red stamp across the top. Final notice. Her stomach dropped as if the floor had tilted. She set the paper down carefully, afraid it might burn her fingertips. This was their childhood home. They'd painted the walls with their mother's help. They'd carved pumpkins on the porch every October. Their father used to carry them up the stairs when they fell asleep during movie nights. After their parents died, this was all they had left of a life that once felt whole. She squeezed her eyes shut. For months she'd been working late, taking freelance transcription jobs at night, doing whatever she could to keep the bills paid. But the numbers were crushing. Some battles outgrew even perseverance. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a small screen lighting up in the dim kitchen. Bank message: your mortgage account is severely past due. Final extension expires December 28. She exhaled sharply and set the phone down, palms pressed against the counter. "Of course," she whispered. "Of course it would be today." Because today was the day a man who never asked for help had walked into her office and offered her something both humiliating and impossible to refuse. "Pretend to be my wife." She had laughed at first, not out loud but in disbelief, the kind that cuts deeper than anger. She had given 9 years of loyalty to that company, 9 years of perfect schedules and clean calendars, 9 years of being invisible so that he could shine. And now the only time he needed her, truly needed her, was to help him maintain a lie. Yet the lie came with enough money to save this house, enough to cover Margaret's therapy, enough to stop that relentless creeping fear that she was failing the only family she had left. She pulled out a chair and sat, letting her head fall into her hands. The kitchen clock ticked like a heartbeat, steady and indifferent. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the window, settling on the frozen lawn. She whispered into her palms, "Why me?" But she wasn't sure if she meant Jonathan's request or the way life had cornered her into this moment. She lifted her head slowly, staring at the foreclosure notice lying beside her. The paper looked too thin to carry the weight it held. Her phone buzzed again, another reminder from the mortgage company, as if the world wanted to press the urgency against her skin. This wasn't greed, this wasn't ambition, this was survival. She exhaled long and unsteady as a question rose in her mind, slow, reluctant, heavy. Could she give up a piece of her dignity to keep a roof over her sister's head? The kettle clicked as it cooled, the sound startling in the quiet room, and Helen knew she was running out of time to decide. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the top-floor hallway, where the air always felt colder, as if success demanded a lower temperature. Helen stepped out, smoothing the wrinkles in her coat, though she knew it wouldn't matter. Her hands were trembling. She hid them in her pockets. Jonathan's office door was half open, a sliver of warm light spilling across the polished floor. She paused there, her breath catching for a moment, not from fear but from the stark shift in him she sensed even before seeing his face. The man who had spoken to her last night in the dim, empty office had been cracking at the edges. The man waiting behind that door wouldn't allow cracks. She pushed gently, and the door eased open. He stood by the window, framed by the gray Chicago skyline. Morning snow drifted past the glass, catching the light in slow drifting spirals. That softness had no place on him. He had already rebuilt his armor, shoulders squared, jaw firm, expression unreadable. "You came," he said without turning. It wasn't gratitude, just quiet acknowledgement, as if he'd known she wouldn't have a choice. Helen stepped inside. "You asked me to." He finally faced her. Gone was last night's rawness, no hint of desperation, no tremor in his voice. Everything about him was composed again, too composed. "I want to make this simple," he said. He tapped the tablet on his desk. A legal document lit up, pages neatly structured and waiting. She walked closer. Each step felt like stepping towards something irreversible. He slid the tablet closer to her, but not before he hesitated just long enough for her to notice. "This outlines the arrangement. 4 days, December 24th through the 27th. Her eyes skimmed the numbers first. $180,000, the exact amount she needed, down to the last overdue notice. Her heart tightened. It felt like being read too easily. "This is a lot of money," she said quietly. "You'll be compensated for your time, your discretion, and the personal nature of the arrangement." His tone was crisp, stripped of the fragile man she'd glimpsed before. "I want you to feel secure." Secure. The word tasted like irony. She lifted the tablet, scrolling slowly. Everything was coldly professional: expectations, boundaries, confidentiality. A role, a script, a schedule. It was so meticulously crafted, she had to wonder how often he lived his life this way, only inside rules. Then she reached the line that made her breath catch. "Neither party shall develop or act upon any emotional attachment. If such attachment occurs, the contract is to be terminated immediately." Her fingers froze on the screen. "What is this?" He didn't flinch. "A necessary condition." "For what?" "For us to remain clear," he said. "This is a performance, nothing real. No. Complications. Complications." He couldn't even say the word feelings. Helen swallowed hard, her chest tightening. "You're outlawing emotions. I'm preventing misunderstandings." Between two grown adults, his jaw ticked. "You'd be surprised how easily people confuse proximity with affection, especially in families like mine." She stared at him, this man who had spent years keeping himself perfectly measured, perfectly untouchable. She'd always assumed that was confidence. Now she realized it was self-protection layered and welded in place. "Jonathan," she said softly, "that rule, it isn't about misunderstandings, it's about fear." A flicker, a tiny fracture in his composure. It disappeared instantly. "This is non-negotiable," he replied. Her breath shook. She wasn't sure if it was anger, hurt, or something deeper, something sadder. If she agreed to this, she would be agreeing to play the part of a woman who was wanted for her silence, her control, not her heart. But then she pictured her sister struggling to breathe after surgery. She pictured the foreclosure notice. The life she'd been fighting so hard not to lose. She set the tablet down. "Why me?" His gaze softened just barely. "Because I trust you. Because you never ask for anything. Because you're steady." And he stopped there, as if finishing the sentence might reveal too much. And she pressed. His eyes held hers for a long, strained moment. "And I can't rely on anyone else." It wasn't the answer she expected. Somehow it hurt more. A long silence stretched between them. The city lights flickered below, reflected in the polished surface of the desk like a scattering of cold stars. She touched the tablet again. Her finger hovered over the line for her signature. "This condition," she said quietly, "it makes me feel like I'm replaceable before I've even started." "You're not," he said too quickly. But his tone wasn't certainty, it was regret. That was the moment, quiet, barely there, when something shifted in him. His jaw tightened as if he'd said too much, revealed too much. Helen inhaled slowly, steadying the tremor in her hands. Then she signed. The digital ink glowed for a second before settling into place, permanent. Jonathan exhaled, but not with relief. It was something heavier, something like the sound of a man bracing for an impact he knew he'd caused. He cleared his throat, straightening again. "We leave tomorrow morning. I'll have a car pick you up at 8. Her eyes lingered on him. The armor he wore seemed thicker now and yet more fragile. She turned toward the door, her heart beating too loudly in her ears. Just before she stepped out, she whispered, almost to herself, though she knew he could hear, "What happened to you, Jonathan, that made love the one thing you had to ban?" The silence behind her deepened, heavy and unbroken. She didn't wait for an answer. The city lights slipped away in the rearview mirror until they were nothing but faint, scattered glimmers, swallowed by the early winter dusk. Helen watched them vanish through the passenger window, her breath fogging the glass as Chicago faded into miles of frozen open fields. The farther they drove, the quieter the world became, the quieter he became. Jonathan kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, yet his jaw was tight in a way she hadn't noticed before. There was something about leaving the city, about heading toward his childhood home, that pulled the air taut around him. Even the hum of the engine seemed muted, as if the car itself knew better than to intrude. Helen shifted her gloves in her lap. "I didn't realize it was this far," she murmured. "It's safer that way," he said, his voice low. "My parents prefer distance. Keeps the world out." A beat passed. "Sometimes it keeps people out too." She caught the way his fingers tightened momentarily around the wheel, a quick strain he covered by adjusting the heating controls. They drove another 10 miles in silence before he reached into the console beside him. He didn't look at her when he placed the small velvet pouch in her hand. "You'll need this." Inside lay a simple gold band, thin, elegant, the kind worn by someone who didn't need flash to prove commitment. Helen held it carefully, the cool metal pressing into her palm. "You chose this?" she asked quietly. "Yes." His voice was so flat she couldn't read it. "There were flashier ones," she said, attempting a small wry smile. "That's why I ignored them." The answer startled her, not because it was sentimental, but because it was honest in a way he usually avoided. He cleared his throat, as though he realized it, retreating back into composure. "You don't have to wear it until we're close," he added. "My family notices everything, especially what they can use." She turned the ring over between her fingers. "Use?" He didn't answer. Not directly. A gust of wind hit the side of the SUV, rattling the frame. Jonathan's knuckles went white again. For the first time, she wondered if this request wasn't really about convenience or strategy or optics. Maybe he truly couldn't walk into that house alone. "How long has it been since you spent Christmas with them?" Helen asked. 3 years. His voice had dropped lower, rougher. "Last time I left early." "Why?" His lips parted slightly, as if he might actually tell her something real. But then he gave a small shake of his head. "It doesn't matter," but it did. She could see it in the way he refocused on the icy road, as if answers might leap out of it. She looked back out the window, watching snow swirl in loose, delicate sheets over the fields. Everything out there felt frozen in time, quiet, brittle, untouched. She felt strangely exposed in the vastness of it. A woman pretending to be something she wasn't. A woman stepping into a life she had no place in. Her stomach tightened. "They'll know," she whispered before she could stop herself. "They'll know I don't belong there." He glanced at her, then a quick, sharp look that made her pulse jump. "You belong anywhere I say you do." The The words came out more forcefully than he planned. He exhaled slowly. Softer, he added, "You'll be fine, Helen." But the certainty in his tone didn't match the flicker of dread in his eyes. She studied him for a moment. The rigid posture, the way he never leaned back in his seat as if bracing for impact, the faint crease between his brows he hadn't had yesterday. What kind of family made a grown man drive like he was heading toward a storm? After another stretch of silence, he spoke again, quieter this time. "They expect me to walk in with a stable life, a partner who makes sense for the image they've built. Marriage is easier than explaining anything else." "And what image is that?" she asked. "The successful eldest son, the one who never makes mistakes." His voice was tight again. "The one who never needs anything." She blinked. "That sounds lonely." He made a soft sound she couldn't decipher. Agreement, dismissal, pain. The lines near his eyes tightened again. "Just understand," he said, "they care about perception, not truth." He paused. "Truth is inconvenient." She thought of the contract, the rule banning attachment, the way he'd shut down after last night's crack in his voice. Yes. She knew something about truths that scared him. The miles stretched on until the sky deepened to a bruised purple. The road curved through a patch of woods, dusted in white branches, bowing under the weight of fresh snow. Somewhere ahead, faint lights broke through the darkness, steady, symmetrical, too perfect to belong to anything ordinary. "We're close," he murmured. Helen slid the ring onto her finger. The metal was cold against her skin, almost startling. It shouldn't have meant anything, but it felt like a small anchor in a place where nothing was familiar. He saw the motion from the corner of his eye. His breath hitched barely, but it was enough to shift the air between them. The gates appeared next, wrought iron tall enough to keep out more than wildlife. As they opened, slowly creaking under the winter weight, Jonathan's shoulders went rigid. The SUV crawled forward along a long gravel drive, lined with bare oak trees wrapped in neat strands of white lights. The house appeared as they rounded a bend, massive stone, symmetrical, glowing with a warm golden wash that somehow felt uninviting. Helen's breath stilled. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's a stage," he replied. The closer they drew, the less air seemed to exist inside the car. Just before he parked, he reached across and touched her hand. It was quick, barely there, but the contact sent a tremor through her chest. "Just..." His voice was almost a whisper. "Don't let them see you're afraid." She turned to look at him. "Are you afraid?" she asked. His eyes flickered toward the house, then back to her. "Every year," he said. The car came to a stop. Snow tapped against the windshield like impatient fingertips. Helen stared at the grand entrance, a knot tightening slowly, painfully in her chest. If this was the way he sounded before stepping inside, what waited for them on the other side of that door? The mansion shone with thousands of white lights, but not one of them felt warm. As Helen stepped onto the stone landing, a gust of cold air swept across the porch, tugging at her coat as if urging her to turn back. Beside her, Jonathan stood tall, shoulders squared, his expression tightening with each breath he took. It was the posture of a man preparing for battle, not a holiday. The front door swung open before either of them reached for the handle. A woman appeared, elegant, statuesque, wrapped in a deep green velvet dress that looked as unyielding as her posture. Eleanor Hale didn't smile. She merely lifted her chin, letting her eyes skim over Helen like someone inspecting a flawed antique. "You're late," she said to her son, though her tone suggested lateness was expected of lesser people, never forgiven in her world. Jonathan's voice turned crisp. "Traffic." Eleanor stepped aside. "Of course. No welcome, no warmth. Just an opening, a doorway into a house that felt as cold as the wind behind them." Helen forced a small smile as she entered, her boots touching polished floors that gleamed like ice. The foyer soared upward into a chandelier of glass icicles, each piece glittering under the lights in a beauty too sharp to touch. The air smelled faintly of pine and something more sterile beneath it, as if the house itself had never been lived in, only curated. "Mrs. Hale," Helen began softly. "Thank you for having..." Eleanor cut her off with a delicate wave of her fingers. "Eleanor is fine. And you must be..." "Helen." She spoke the name as though tasting it for the first time and finding the flavor unfamiliar. Jonathan rested a hand lightly on Helen's back, a gesture meant to anchor them both. "My wife," he said, voice steady. A flicker of something moved behind Eleanor's eyes, surprise, displeasure, curiosity, all crowded too closely together to distinguish. "Your wife," she repeated. "How unexpected." Before Helen could respond, two more figures appeared, Jonathan's older brother Martin and his younger sister Caroline. Martin offered a handshake that lasted barely a second. His eyes were cool, detached, as if he were already calculating what Helen's presence said about his brother's judgment. Caroline, by contrast, smiled wide, too wide. The kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes but stretched her lips in a way meant to signal friendliness while concealing something sharper beneath. "So this is the woman who captured the untouchable Jonathan Hale," she said brightly. Helen's stomach tightened. It was the tone, sweet but laced with challenge. Jonathan kept his hand on Helen's back, but Helen could feel the shift in him already, his spine straightening, his words shortening, his breath becoming measured. She had seen this version of him before in the boardroom, but seeing him slip into it here in his own home was like watching someone armor up in real time. Eleanor gestured vaguely toward the drawing room. "We have drinks prepared. Do join us." As they walked, the quiet grandeur of the house wrapped around them long corridors, lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors' rooms, arranged with careful symmetry, decorations placed with precision rather than joy. Helen found herself standing a little straighter, speaking a little softer, as though the walls themselves demanded perfection. She could feel their gazes, measuring her height, her posture, her clothes, even the way she held Jonathan's arm. She wasn't used to being scrutinized, she was used to being invisible. And yet here she was, painfully, uncomfortably seen. Caroline drifted to Helen's side. "So, you married quickly, I hear." Helen offered a gentle laugh. "Life can surprise you." Caroline tilted her head. "Jonathan doesn't like surprises." Helen glanced toward him. He was standing with his brother, his expression unreadable, but his shoulders were too stiff for comfort. The room fell quiet when Eleanor crossed to them, a glass of white wine in hand. She held it delicately, like an instrument of interrogation. "My son married." Impulsively, she said, her smile small and deliberate. "How very unlike him." The words landed lightly, almost politely, but the meaning beneath them struck with the precision of a blade. Heat rose in Helen's face. She felt Jonathan shift beside her, a faint exhale escaping through his nose. But he didn't correct his mother. He didn't soften the blow. He simply looked ahead, face composed as if he had long since learned not to react. Helen swallowed her fingers, brushing the simple wedding band he'd given her. She steadied her breath. "Some things don't require years to understand," she said softly. Eleanor's eyebrows lifted half a fraction, the most emotion she'd shown. But whether it was amusement or disdain, Helen couldn't tell. A staff member entered, then saving her from Eleanor's lingering gaze. "Dinner will be served shortly." The family moved toward the dining room, their steps graceful, almost choreographed. Helen followed a pace behind, feeling the distance between her and Jonathan widen with each echoing footstep across the marble floor. He had asked her to act like his wife, yet she felt more alone here than she had in years. As they reached the threshold of the grand dining room, Caroline leaned close enough that Helen could feel her breath warm on her ear. "Just so you know," she whispered, her tone sugar-lined but cold, "underneath this house consumes people who don't understand it." Helen froze. Caroline smiled sweetly and slipped past her, leaving Helen standing at the doorway, the glittering table stretching before her like a stage set for failure. A single question tightened in her chest, as sharp as the chandelier light above her. How was she supposed to survive a single weekend in a place built to watch her fall? The first attack came disguised as a polite question over roasted turkey. Helen hadn't even lifted her fork when Lydia, poised flawless and wearing a shade of red that announced authority, leaned forward with an expression that might have passed for curiosity among kinder people. "So Helen," she said lightly, "where did you two meet?" The question floated across the table like a silk scarf hiding a blade. Conversations around them, softened forks, paused mid-air. Even the candle flames seemed to lean in. Helen's pulse jumped. She hadn't expected to panic so quickly, not in front of so many polished silver utensils and starched linen napkins. They had rehearsed details for almost everything: dates, timelines, how long they'd been together, which stories to emphasize. But they had never discussed how they met. She glanced at Jonathan, who was cutting his turkey with the precision of someone accustomed to scrutiny. He must have felt her eyes on him, but he didn't look up. Not yet. Lydia waited, chin propped lightly on her hand. "It must have been memorable," she added sweetly. Caroline smirked behind her wine glass. Helen inhaled, her fingers tightening around her fork. She opened her mouth, hoping anything would come out before silence exposed her. She began, but the words tangled in her throat. Her mind went blank, white and cold like the snow outside the tall dining room windows. She could almost see Eleanor's faint, satisfied exhale from the other end of the table. Jonathan finally raised his eyes. Helen felt it, that silent shift in him, like a steel beam locking into place. "We met at a coffee shop downtown," he said calmly, setting his knife down with deliberate grace. Every head turned toward him. His voice carried an unfamiliar warmth, subtle but unmistakable. It was one of those winter mornings where the city feels half asleep. Slush everywhere lines out the door. His gaze rested on Helen, and she felt something inside her tighten. The barista had called in sick, so one of the staff was drowning behind the counter. Helen stepped in to help. She wasn't an employee, just someone who couldn't watch someone struggle. Helen blinked. She had never done such a thing. Yet the way he told it, it almost felt like she had. He continued. "She moved like she'd done it 100 times. Took orders, wiped tables, told jokes to the regulars. She didn't know I was there. I was just another guy waiting for his coffee." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his mouth. "She handed me a cup without looking up. Only when our fingers brushed did she meet my eyes." The room fell silent. Even the servants paused as they exchanged empty platters for full ones. "It was the easiest decision I've ever made," Jonathan finished softly. "To ask for her name." Helen stared at him, her heart beating a little too fast. The tenderness in his voice wasn't the kind that came from rehearsal, nor was it the kind a man used to impress a judgmental family. It sounded real, and that frightened her more than Lydia's ambush. Across the table, Martin cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "A charming story," he said, though the edge in his voice suggested he didn't buy a word of it. Caroline leaned back, assessing Helen with new eyes, as if the narrative had thrown her expectations off balance. But Eleanor simply watched Jonathan, not Helen, not the ring, not the story. Her son. Her gaze narrowed as though searching for a seam in his composure. Dinner continued, but the rhythm had changed. Conversations resumed, though softer. Helen kept her eyes on her plate, grateful for the momentary reprieve. Her shoulders slowly relaxed, but not fully. "Not in this house." She reached for her water glass when Caroline's voice cut in again. "So Helen," she said lightly, "what exactly do you do?" "I work in administration," Helen replied, keeping her tone even. "For Jonathan's company, isn't that right?" Caroline tapped her fork against her plate. "Is that where your romance began? Office proximity, and all that?" Jonathan answered before Helen could speak. "Not everything is a cliché, Caroline. But isn't it lovely when life imitates art?" Caroline countered her, smile tight. Helen forced a small laugh, though it landed more like a sigh. The walls of the dining room felt closer now, the chandelier above, a bit too bright. She felt like an actor who had stumbled onto the wrong stage, surrounded by critics who had memorized the script better than she had. The worst part was the way Jonathan changed the moment the focus shifted from him to his family. His posture stiffened, his words shortened. His warmth from seconds before cooled into something distant again. The tenderness from the coffee shop story seemed to evaporate, replaced by a guardedness she recognized all too well. He was still protecting her, that she could feel, but he was also protecting himself. The meal dragged on, punctuated by pointed questions and careful judgments disguised as casual remarks. Helen found herself nodding too often, smiling too politely, reacting just late enough to raise eyebrows. When dessert was served, a flawless apple tart with a glaze like stained glass, Eleanor set her fork down with deliberate poise. "I must say," she said, her voice deceptively soft, "my son has always chosen, carefully, methodically, so it is surprising to see him make such a sudden choice in marriage." The air above the table thinned. "Sometimes certainty doesn't require time," Jonathan replied, his tone steady but sharper than before. Eleanor's eyes glinted. "Or perhaps time reveals truths that haste overlooks." Helen felt the words hit her like cold water. The table went still again. Jonathan's jaw clenched. Helen recognized the sign, the way the muscle near his ear tightened. It meant he was seconds from snapping, but he didn't. Instead, he placed his napkin down and rose from his seat. "Excuse us," he said quietly. "Helen and I need some air." Helen followed him out of the room, aware of every pair of eyes tracking their departure. When they stepped into the hallway, she inhaled sharply as though she'd been underwater. Jonathan didn't speak at first. He just stood there, breathing hard, staring at a point somewhere past the marble floor. "Your family," she whispered. He shut his eyes. "I know." She hesitated, searching his face. "That story you told, was it just for them?" He opened his eyes slowly. A storm lived behind them. "It shouldn't have sounded the way it did," he murmured. "But it did." He looked away, jaw tight, as if ashamed of the softness he'd allowed to surface. She felt her heartbeat stumble, confused and unsteady. Why had his voice trembled like that? And why did she wish just for a moment that the story had been true? She woke to a sound no one expects from a man like him, a choked, terrified plea. Helen's eyes snapped open in the dim room, her breath suspended in the cold hush of the night. The suite Eleanor had chosen for them was beautiful, but beauty didn't soften the darkness. Pressing in around them heavy curtains, a fire gone to embers, shadows stretching along the walls like silent witnesses. For a moment, Helen wasn't sure if she dreamed it. Then she heard it again, faint, broken, seeping from the other side of the room where Jonathan lay. "Don't leave. Please don't go." Her heart jolted. She pushed back the heavy quilt and stepped onto the thick rug, her bare feet sinking into its softness. The room was cold despite the dying fire. She crossed, slowly, guided by instinct more than thought, and found Jonathan tangled in the sheets, his breath coming fast, his forehead damp with sweat. His face, usually carved from stone, looked strained, almost young in its fear. Another whisper escaped him. "Please, don't go." The words punched a knot of emotion straight into her chest. "Jonathan," she murmured, kneeling beside the bed. "Wake up. It's just a dream." He didn't stir, his hand clenched around the pillow as if trying to hold on to someone slipping away. His breathing hitched, uneven, pained. "Jonathan," she said again, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're safe. Wake up." He jerked slightly at her touch, eyes flying open with a gasp. For a second he stared at her like he didn't know where he was. Then awareness returned in a slow, painful wave. "Helen." His voice was hoarse, cracked open. She nodded softly. "You were dreaming." He dragged a hand over his face, exhaling shakily. When she reached for the blanket to cover him, he flinched, not away from her but out of embarrassment, as though being seen this way hurt more than the nightmare itself. "I'm fine," he muttered, the familiar armor scrambling to reconstruct itself. But it was too late. She had already seen what lived behind it. "That didn't sound fine," she said gently. He looked away, jaw tight in the dim firelight. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," she lied. Or maybe it wasn't a lie. Something had woken her, something deeper than sound. The silence stretched between them, fragile and trembling. Jonathan's breath trembled once before he hid it behind a deeper inhale. He tried to sit up, but she laid a hand on his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "Just breathe a minute." He froze. No one told Jonathan Hale to slow down. No one touched him like he might break. She expected him to pull away, but he didn't. He swallowed the motion visible along the line of his throat. His eyes drifted closed, just for a second, the briefest surrender. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For what?" "For this." His chest rose and fell in a rough rhythm. "For making you see me like this." Her fingers tightened slightly on his arm. "Everyone dreams. Everyone has things that hurt. Not like this." The words were barely audible. The shame in them startled her, not because he felt it, but because he let it slip out loud. She waited, hoping he might say more, offer some clue to the ghost that had chased him into sleep. But the silence returned heavier, now filled with pressure rather than peace. She drew a slow breath. "Do you want to talk about it?" His eyes snapped open, not in anger but in something close to fear. "No." The refusal was immediate, instinctive, protective. "Okay," she whispered. She didn't push. She knew what it meant to hold the pieces of yourself too tightly to let anyone else see them. He shifted, trying to compose himself, but his hands were still shaking slightly beneath the blankets. He curled them into fists to hide it. Helen sat down on the edge of the mattress, unsure whether to stay or step back. The fire crackled weakly behind her, casting soft amber lines along the side of his face. His breaths were beginning to steady, but the exhaustion in his posture gave him away. She spoke quietly. "Jonathan, you don't have to be unbreakable." His throat tightened. She saw it. A small, involuntary movement. "People survive much worse than admitting they're human," she added. Something in his expression shifted, a tremor of vulnerability flickering through his gaze before he looked down again. "Not in this house," he said softly. The words settled between them like a confession he hadn't meant to release. His shoulders sagged. For a moment the man before her wasn't the CEO, the controlled negotiator, the sun returning under pressure. He was just someone who hadn't rested in a very long time. Helen reached for the blanket again and pulled it gently up to his chest. His eyes lifted to hers, startled by the tenderness. She smiled faintly. "Try to sleep." He swallowed hard. "Helen." His voice had changed, softer, stripped of every layer he normally used to keep the world at arm's length. He said her name not as her employer, not as a man maintaining an arrangement, but as someone reaching out for anchor in a dark room he didn't know how to navigate alone. She felt the sound of it ripple through her. He let out an unsteady breath. "Thank you." It was just 2 words, but in the dim quiet they felt like something more. Something neither of them was allowed to name. She stood slowly, intending to return to her side of the room before the moment grew too close. But as she turned, she heard his voice again, low, uncertain, almost breaking. "Helen, don't go too far." She froze. He didn't repeat it. He didn't look at her. But his hand, the one closest to the edge of the bed, stayed open as though waiting for something he didn't know how to ask for. And she was left standing in the half-light, heart aching with a question she wasn't supposed to feel. What haunted him so fiercely that even in sleep he feared being left alone? Christmas morning exposed the truth. Real gifts never glitter. Helen realized it the moment she stepped into the Hale family's grand sitting room, where wrapping paper shimmered like polished frost and ribbons curled in perfect spirals around boxes stacked almost to the mantel. Everything looked expensive, immaculate, and utterly void of feeling. The family sat in a neat arc, each person perched upright, as if even joy had rules in this house. Eleanor distributed gifts with the same poise she applied to business meetings, calling out names without a hint of warmth. Martin unwrapped an antique pen set with a nod of approval. Caroline received a designer scarf she'd probably chosen herself. Lydia opened a small velvet case containing diamond earrings and said a crisp, "Thank you, Mother," before fastening them with meticulous precision. No laughter, no gasps, no soft, grateful smiles, just ritual, just performance. Jonathan stood beside Helen, hands lightly clasped behind his back, expression unreadable. When Eleanor finally handed them a box, one gift for both, Helen felt every pair of eyes turn to watch. Inside was a crystal frame engraved with their initials and the date of their wedding. Helen swallowed. The gift sparkled beautifully in the light, but it felt cold in her hands, heavy with the reminder that everything here was built out of expectation, not affection. "Display it somewhere appropriate," Eleanor said, turning away before Helen could respond. Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His silence wasn't agreement, it was survival. The exchange ended quickly. No lingering moments, no warmth. Everyone drifted off into separate corners of the house, eager to resume their own curated routines. Helen stood near the windows, watching snow fall in a peaceful silver hush across the lawn. She felt strangely apart from everything, not lonely exactly, but aware of the emptiness in the room they'd just left. That was when Jonathan approached, carrying a small wrapped package in both hands. No ribbon, no glitter, just plain paper, folded carefully. "I didn't want to give this in front of them," he said softly. Her breath caught. "You didn't have to get me anything. Maybe I did." He handed her the package. His fingers brushed hers, a light barely their touch, but it was enough to send a warm ripple up her arm. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a paperback novel, old edges a little worn, the kind someone had kept on a shelf for years. She stared at the title. It was a book she had mentioned exactly once, months ago, during a rushed lunch break, a brief moment when she'd let slip that it had been her mother's favorite. She had never thought he'd remembered. Her voice trembled. "Jonathan, how did you fall? You said you lost your copy after your dad sold the house." His voice was quiet, as if revealing something he'd kept hidden. "I found one from the same print year." Her chest tightened painfully. She traced the worn spine, imagining someone else's hands holding it decades earlier, imagining her mother reading the same edition. Something warm and fragile swelled in her bigger than gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on her face, searching for something, or perhaps searching to confirm what he feared. She took a breath, steadying herself. "I have something for you too." His brows lifted. "You do." She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a small folded piece of thick paper. "I wasn't sure if I should, but it felt right." She handed it to him. He opened it slowly, his expression shifting the moment he saw the lines of charcoal and soft shading. It was a sketch, simple, almost modest, of the old oak tree outside the estate, the one whose branches twisted like outstretched arms against the winter sky. "I drew it last night," Helen said. "I noticed you kept looking at it. I thought maybe it meant something to you." For a long moment Jonathan didn't speak. His thumb brushed lightly over the paper as if afraid the drawing might smudge at his touch. His breath came a fraction slower, deeper. "This," he swallowed, struggling to finish the sentence. "Helen, this is beautiful." His voice sounded different, threaded with something raw, something unguarded. It startled her more than any harsh word ever could have. "It's just a sketch," she murmured, suddenly shy. "No." He shook his head, gaze still locked on the drawing. "It's more than that." He held it as though it were precious. More precious than the diamond earrings, the antique pen, the crystal frame, more precious than anything in this house. Helen felt her heartbeat stumble in her chest, unsteady, unexpected. The moment stretched between them, warm, trembling, dangerous. They weren't supposed to give each other gifts that meant anything. They weren't supposed to step past the contract's invisible line. They weren't supposed to share anything real. But here they were, pressed into a quiet corner of a cold mansion, holding pieces of each other they weren't meant to expose. Jonathan finally looked up. His voice was low, almost hoarse. "Why does this feel like?" He stopped himself, jaw tightening. He folded the drawing carefully, almost reverently. She waited, but he didn't finish the thought. Instead, he slipped the sketch into his inner jacket pocket close to his chest, as if that were the safest place he knew. Helen's breath caught. If this was pretend, if this was just an arrangement, if this was only survival, why did his eyes look like he was remembering something they had never lived? And why did she suddenly fear that she was too? The room fell. Silent the moment Lydia lifted the mistletoe above their heads. Helen heard the gasp before she even registered what was happening. A soft, delighted shock that moved through the holiday party like a ripple across still water. She turned and saw Lydia smiling with triumphant sweetness, the sprig of mistletoe pinched between manicured fingers held right above Helen and Jonathan. Guests shifted, forming a loose circle around them, eyes gleaming with curious expectation. "Well," Lydia said brightly, "tradition is tradition." Helen felt her breath falter. Christmas music still played in the background, soft piano notes, drifting through the air, yet everything around her blurred into a hush, as though the room had narrowed to only two people. Jonathan stood beside her, rigid, his posture caught between refusal and duty. His eyes flicked toward the mistletoe, then down to Helen. For the first time since they arrived in the estate, he looked uncertain. A trap, a test, a moment designed to expose them. Helen's heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She didn't know whether Lydia wanted to embarrass her or him, or both. Maybe the intention didn't matter. All that mattered was the expectation gathering in the room like a held breath. Jonathan inhaled slowly, almost cautiously. "We don't have to," but Helen saw something in his gaze, something that asked a question without words. He waited for her to choose, not as part of a contract, not as a man following protocol, but as someone offering her the chance to walk away from the moment if she needed to. Her throat tightened. She gave the tiniest nod. A decision small enough to miss, big enough to break everything. Jonathan's breath hitched so faintly only she could hear it. He stepped closer. The chatter faded into a soft hum behind them. Helen's pulse drummed in her ears as she felt the heat of his body, the faint scent of cedar and winter air clinging to his coat. He lifted a hand and touched her cheek with a gentleness that didn't feel rehearsed. His thumb brushed her jawline, slow, deliberate. She tried not to tremble. "It's just a kiss," someone whispered nearby, but nothing about this felt small. Jonathan leaned in. His forehead nearly touched hers, his breath warm against her skin. She felt the moment stretch, pause, gather weight like the heartbeat before a storm breaks. Then he kissed her. It was meant to be brief, polite, appropriate. It wasn't. The first press of his mouth was soft, restrained, careful, the kiss of a man performing. But the moment her hand touched his chest, his composure faltered. His lips deepened just a fraction, his hand sliding from her cheek to the back of her neck, pulling her closer in a movement that felt unplanned, undeniable. Heat flushed through her, overwhelming in its suddenness. Real, dangerously real. Someone sighed in the circle. Lydia's smile sharpened. Eleanor's glass paused midair, but none of it reached Helen. The world had blurred away entirely. Jonathan's breath mingled with hers. His lips softened, then pressed again, slower, this time not for the audience, but for something neither of them dared to acknowledge. It felt like remembering something they'd never lived, like discovering a truth that had been waiting between them all along. When he finally pulled back, his hand lingered a moment too long on her jaw. His eyes were dark, searching hers as though trying to understand what had just happened or what it had undone. A heartbeat passed, then another. Caroline broke the silence with a delighted clap. "Well, that was certainly convincing." Laughter followed, brittle and amused. The circle dissolved as guests wandered back to the buffet, satisfied with the spectacle. The music swelled again, soft and festive. But Jonathan didn't move. Helen felt her own breath unsteady, her lips tingling with the ghost of a kiss she shouldn't have wanted. Jonathan's voice was barely a whisper. "Helen." She looked up at him. His eyes held something raw, something shaken loose, something that contradicted the rule he'd written in bold capital letters. Neither party shall develop or act upon any emotional attachment. He exhaled sharply as if the line itself had cracked inside him. That wasn't part of the arrangement, he said, though his tone wasn't reprimanding. It was almost frightened. Helen felt the words land deep in her chest. I know. We shouldn't. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. We can't, she nodded. I know that too. But the truth sat between them, impossible to ignore. He looked away first, running a hand through his hair with a shaky exhale. She watched the movement, how unguarded it was, how unlike him. For a man who lived inside control, he suddenly looked like he couldn't find any ground at all. Are you all right? She asked softly. No. His voice was rough. And I don't know why. He took a step back, creating space that felt too wide, too cold. The room around them glowed with warm lights and soft gold decor, but none of it reached them. Helen touched her lips without thinking. The memory of the kiss pulsed under her fingertips. Jonathan's eyes flicked to the gesture, then away again quickly, as if the sight hurt more than he expected. Lydia's laughter drifted from across the room. Caroline whispered something to Martin, their eyes darting toward Helen. And Eleanor, from her place near the mantel, watched everything with a calculating stillness. Jonathan straightened abruptly, his posture snapping back into order. We should rejoin them, but his voice betrayed him. It was strained, unsteady, a man trying to rebuild a wall he no longer believed in. Helen nodded, stomach tightening. Together, they walked back toward the crowd, step by careful step, like two people returning from a place they never should have gone. Yet the air between them remained charged, trembling, unstable. How could they return to pretending? How could they stand side by side and act untouched? And how could a single kiss, meant as nothing, shatter every rule that was supposed to protect them? The car door shut on the Hale estate, and with it, the fragile world they had built over 4 impossible days. The sound echoed through the cold morning air like the snapping of a thread. Helen settled into the passenger seat, her fingers stiff inside her gloves, her breath fogging the window as the Bentley pulled away from the mansion. Jonathan didn't speak. He didn't even start the engine right away. He sat there, hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead as though the long driveway was a cliff he had no choice but to drive over. Helen kept her gaze forward too. The house loomed in the side mirror, glittering under the pale winter sun, its iciness sharper in daylight. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress that had swallowed them whole and spat them out changed. Finally, Jonathan turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. The silence inside the car was thicker than the fog outside. A silence that carried the weight of a kiss neither could forget and a rule they had both broken. They drove through the iron gates, and the massive estate disappeared behind a stand of winter-bare trees. The world grew quieter as they left the property and eased onto the narrow county road that would eventually lead them back to Chicago. Helen's chest tightened with every passing mile. She had known this was coming. She had prepared for this moment the second her aunt called her with the news that the mortgage had been paid off. She had felt the end creeping closer, with each quiet look exchanged, each unguarded moment, each breath that seemed to link them together. But knowledge didn't soften the pain. Snow dusted the fields outside. The sky hung low, gray, and heavy, casting the world in muted colors. The windshield wipers brushed away thin streaks of frost, rhythmic and steady, the only sound in the car apart from the engine's hum. Jonathan kept both hands on the wheel, his jaw tense, eyes fixed on the road like a man afraid to look anywhere else. Helen folded her hands in her lap. You don't have to drive me all the way, she murmured. I do. His voice was low, almost hoarse. She didn't argue. The words weren't really about the drive. They both knew that. A few minutes passed before he spoke again. Helen. Her heart squeezed. God, she wished he wouldn't say her name like that, softly, carefully, like it meant something fragile. He swallowed, his throat shifting. About last night, she stopped him gently. You don't have to explain. He inhaled sharply, an uneven breath. I think I do. But he said nothing more. The road stretched ahead, long and quiet, and he kept his eyes fixed on it as though afraid of what might slip out if he looked at her directly. Helen turned toward the window, watching a cluster of grain silos roll past like ghosts. Her reflection stared back at her tired, heartsick, older than she felt. She blinked hard. You know the contract is broken, she said softly. He flinched. Yes, and you know what that means. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Seattle. Helen nodded. A long exhale left him quiet but sharp. You don't have to go. She turned her head slightly. You wrote the rule. "I did," he admitted, voice low torn. But Jonathan didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. The air between them pulsed, with everything unsaid, the kiss, the softness in his voice, the way he'd looked at her under the mistletoe, as if he was seeing her for the first time. Helen closed her eyes for a moment. "If I stay," she whispered, "what? Then I go back to being your assistant. You walk past my desk every morning like nothing happened. We pretend those days didn't unravel us, both." He didn't answer. She opened her eyes, staring ahead. "I can't do that, Jonathan. I won't." His breath trembled, the slightest break in his controlled exterior. "I never meant to hurt me," she finished quietly. He didn't deny it. He only said, painfully honest, "I didn't expect you to matter." The words hit her like a blow, not cruel but devastating in their sincerity. As if he'd built walls so thick he didn't know how to step out of them now. The skyline appeared faintly on the horizon, distant and cold. Chicago rising like a gray blade against the winter sky. Closer. Too close. Helen felt the moment slipping away, the last stretch of road before everything ended. She reached into the small pocket of her coat and pulled out the simple wedding band he'd given her on the drive over to the estate. The metal felt warm from her skin. She held it in her palm for a moment, then turned it between her fingers. Jonathan glanced at her, a flicker of alarm in his eyes. "Helen, don't." She placed the ring gently on the console between them. "It was never really mine," she said, voice steady despite the heaviness in her chest. His breath caught a quiet, wounded sound. The city drew nearer. Traffic thickened. They were almost back. Jonathan reached for the ring, then stopped halfway, his hand suspended in midair. His jaw tensed as he curled his fingers back to the steering wheel instead. Silence fell again, but it was different now. Not empty, not cold, but unbearably full. Full of the goodbye neither of them wanted to say. When he pulled up in front of her apartment, neither moved. The engine idled softly, the heater blowing warm air across her knees. Snowflakes drifted past the windshield in slow, spiraling patterns. Helen finally reached for the door handle. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Take care, Jonathan." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and something inside him seemed to fracture. "Helen." He swallowed hard. "This doesn't feel like the end." Her eyes stung. It should. But as she stepped out into the cold morning air, closing the door behind her, she felt the truth settle deep in her bones. Nothing about this felt finished. Nothing at all. Seattle rain had a way of making even strong hearts feel small, and Helen felt that truth every morning as she walked from her apartment to the transit station. The drizzle soaked the edges of her coat, beating on her eyelashes, settling into her bones with a chill she couldn't quite shake. She used to think Chicago winters were cruel, but Seattle's grayness was different, softer, quieter, the kind of weather that didn't shout its sadness but whispered it until you felt it in your chest. Her new office was smaller, tucked inside a brick building overlooking Elliott Bay. Her coworkers were kind, polite in that Pacific Northwest way, and no one expected too much of her. She got her work done, went home, checked on her sister every evening through long phone calls filled with relief. Margaret's recovery was going well, better than the doctors predicted. The mortgage had been cleared entirely. Helen no longer woke in the night worrying about overdue bills or foreclosure notices sliding under the door. She should have felt safe. She should have felt free. Instead, she felt like she had stepped into a life she was only borrowing. Her small apartment overlooked an alley and a sliver of sky. She'd tried decorating framed prints, soft lamps, a blanket draped over the sofa, but the place still felt temporary, as if she were only passing through. Some nights she'd wake to the distant foghorns and lie still listening to the muted hum of the city and wonder when her heart had last belonged fully to her. The answer came quickly. It had been in a mansion lit with thousands of cold white lights in a bedroom where she'd held the wrist of a man waking from a nightmare in the quiet spaces between guarded words. Jonathan. His name hovered in her mind like a breath she couldn't let out. At the office in Seattle, people occasionally asked why she had moved states so abruptly. She answered with half-truths. Family needs a fresh start, and they accepted it without digging deeper. No one knew how carefully she avoided looking at emails from Chicago headquarters, how she deleted messages before reading them, how she trained herself not to glance at any news that mentioned Hale Industries. Distance was supposed to help her forget. It hadn't. Back in Chicago, Jonathan Hale moved through his days with the precision everyone expected of him, but the sharpness had dulled. His assistant, his new assistant, was efficient, more talkative than Helen, quick with numbers, but not with silence. She called him sir in a crisp, practiced tone, and Jonathan found himself missing the sound of his name, spoken quietly, thoughtfully, as if it mattered. His office was immaculate again, nothing out of place. His schedule was full. Contracts moved, deals, advanced meetings flowed. To anyone watching, Jonathan was a man fully in control. But control had grown heavy, like armor he no longer wanted but didn't know how to remove. He avoided the guest suite at the Hale estate. He avoided phone calls from his mother. He avoided holiday invitations for next year. Worst of all, he avoided opening the box of personal effects he'd taken from Helen's old desk the day she left. Weeks passed before he finally forced himself to look through it. He expected leftover files, pens, maybe a forgotten mug. Instead, he found the small padded envelope she'd used to protect the sketch of the old oak tree, the drawing she'd given him on Christmas morning. It had slipped into the bottom of the box and remained there unseen. He froze when he recognized it. He lifted it carefully, unfolding the thin paper. The drawing was simple, made with gentle strokes, the kind that carried attention and patience. He remembered that morning with painful clarity, the way she had smiled shyly, the way she hadn't expected him to value it. But he had. He still did. He sat heavily at his desk, the sketch trembling faintly between his fingers. The office was quiet, Chicago winter sunlight spilling across the hardwood floor. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had changed. Inside, something inside him cracked open in a way that was impossible to ignore. Fear had always ruled him. Fear of repeating the past. Fear of losing someone again. Fear of being seen and found wanting. But holding that sketch, he realized something sharper. Fear had cost him the one person who had looked at him with real understanding. He set the drawing down gently. Then he leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, breath shaking through his chest in a way he hadn't allowed since she left. When he opened them again, the decision was already forming, clear, steady, unstoppable. He didn't try to talk himself out of it. Not this time. Jonathan stood, grabbed his coat, and left the office without a word to his staff. He drove home with the sketch on the passenger seat, glancing at it at every red light like a talisman, a reminder, a truth he could no longer outrun. At his penthouse, he packed a small bag, barely thinking, just moving, each motion fueled by something deeper than resolve. He looked around the apartment, realizing how empty it felt, without her quiet presence, without someone to share the stillness with. He picked up the sketch one more time. Then he opened his laptop and booked the first flight to Seattle. The confirmation email appeared almost instantly. Jonathan stared at the screen, his heartbeat steadying in his chest for the first time in months. But as he zipped his bag and headed for the door, one thought lingered, cold and uncertain. Would she even want to see him again? Helen saw him through the rain first, a lone figure with a black umbrella, standing on the opposite corner like he had been carved out of the gray evening. Seattle traffic rolled between them in waves of headlights and wet pavement, but he didn't move. He wasn't checking his phone, he wasn't glancing at the time. He was just waiting. Waiting in a way that made the world around him seem oddly irrelevant. She froze at the curb, breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. Her coworkers brushed past with polite nods, then vanished into the mist. The crosswalk sign blinked red, the white walking man waiting his turn. Helen felt every raindrop on her face, cold and startling. It couldn't be him, except it was. As if sensing her, Jonathan looked up. Even through the curtain of rain, she recognized the planes of his face, the set of his shoulders, the way his gaze locked onto hers and didn't let go. For a heartbeat, they simply stared across the street at each other, two people separated by 20 feet of wet asphalt and months of ache. The light changed. People surged forward. Somehow she found herself moving with them, step by step, her shoes splashing in shallow puddles. She never took her eyes off him. He stepped off the curb as well, walking toward her. The umbrella tilted just enough to cover his head and shoulders. Cars hissed past, but between them the world narrowed to a small circle of rain and breathing and disbelief. They met in the middle of the crosswalk, then continued to the other side together, as if pulled by an invisible thread. When they reached the sidewalk, he angled the umbrella to cover her too. The air under it felt suddenly warm, intimate, cut off from the rest of the city. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the patter of rain. Jonathan looked at her, like he hadn't allowed himself to even picture this moment in detail, afraid it would be taken away. His suit was damp at the edges, his hair slightly disheveled, small imperfections she had almost never seen on him. "I made a mistake," he said. His voice came out low, roughened around the edges. "A catastrophic one." Her heart stuttered. "Jonathan, let me say this," he cut in gently, hands tightening on the umbrella handle. "Please, just once without rules and contracts, and fear." She swallowed the cold air, sharp in her lungs. "I'm listening." I spent years building walls, he said, the words spilling slowly, as if each one cost him something, telling myself I was protecting myself, that if I controlled everything, I would never be blindsided again. I turned my life into a series of transactions because feelings ruined me once. He glanced away for a moment, jaw tightening. I lost someone a long time ago. Not to death, to choice. She decided my work, my distance, my inability to be fully present made me unworthy of staying. And she was right. I was half there, half somewhere else, always looking ahead to the next deadline instead of the person in front of me. Helen felt the comment land in a quiet place inside her. I told myself I would never make that mistake again, he continued. So, I traded connection for control. I built rules instead of relationships. I convinced my family I was fine, that being alone was a choice. And then you walked into my office every day with your steady calm and your quiet strength, and you were not a variable I could manage. Her breath hitched. The rain drummed on the umbrella, steady, insistent. I wrote that rule in the contract because I was terrified, he admitted. Terrified of what could happen if I let you in. Terrified of needing someone who could hurt me simply by leaving. So I tried to make sure feelings were never allowed. For you, for me. His mouth twisted, almost bitter at himself. And then I went and broke my own rule first. Helen's eyes stung. You're not the only one who broke it. He looked at her, really looked this time. I know. And instead of owning that, I hid behind the contract. I watched you pack up your desk. I watched you walk away. I told myself I was respecting my own boundaries, that it was for your good, for my sanity. But the truth is, his voice lowered, I was a coward. The last word seemed to tear out of him. She watched his throat move as he swallowed. His eyes, usually shielded, were bare now, full of regret, of something deeper she didn't dare name for him. I don't want a world where you're not in it, he said simply. Not as an assistant, not as a temporary arrangement. Not as a convenient solution to my family's expectations. I want you, the woman who stepped into my chaos and somehow made it feel like a place I could breathe in. He finally reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out something small, glinting faintly in the low light. The ring. It lay in his palm, simple and unadorned rain speckling the metal. I know what this was before, he said. A prop, a lie, a symbol of everything I was too afraid to offer in truth. His gaze locked with hers. I'm not asking you to forget that. I'm asking you to let it become something else. A promise that if you let me try again, I won't hide behind contracts or distance or rules. I'll show up. Fully, flaws and all. He didn't kneel. He didn't hold it out toward her in some grand gesture. He just stood there on a wet Seattle sidewalk umbrella, a tilted hand open, his entire guarded life held in the curve of his fingers. Helen's heart pounded so hard she could almost hear it. The rain had soaked the hem of her coat and crept up her jeans. Cars passed in a watery blur. Somewhere down the block, a bus hissed to a stop. She stared at the ring, then at him. This was everything she had wanted and everything she was afraid to accept. The man who once wrote rules to keep her at arm's length was now offering her the very thing he'd withheld from the world. But promises were easy in the rain. Living them was something else entirely. He seemed to read her hesitation in the lift of her shoulders, the tightness around her eyes. I can't promise I'll never be afraid again, he said quietly. I can't promise it will be simple, or neat, or well-behaved. A faint, sad smile touched his mouth. I can only promise I won't walk away this time. Not when it's hard. Not when you see the worst of me. She exhaled slowly. Her gloved hand rose, hovering over his open palm. He went still, eyes fixed on her, his breath shallow. For a moment it felt like the whole city held its breath with them. Helen closed her hand over his, wrapping his fingers around the ring, instead of taking it. His eyes widened, a flash of hurt and confusion breaking through. Helen, I don't want the ring, she said softly, her voice trembling and sure at the same time. The light in his expression dimmed as if she'd just blown out the one candle he'd dared to light. She tightened her grip on his hand, not letting him pull away. I want the man holding it. For a heartbeat, he simply stared at her, rainwater glistening on his lashes. Then something shifted in his face, a release, a softening, a kind of stunned relief that made him look younger, less haunted. He let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in his chest since the day she left. The umbrella slipped in his grip, tilting slightly, letting a sheet of cool rain spill over their shoulders. Helen didn't move, neither did he. They simply stood there, hand in hand, while the city moved around them, oblivious. She didn't know what came next, what it meant for his work, her job, their families, the careful routines they'd each constructed to keep life manageable. She didn't know how they would navigate his fears or her own. She only knew that for the first time in a very long time, the future felt like something they might write together instead of avoid apart. And as she searched his face in the soft gray light, one quiet question rose in her chest, not of doubt but of wondering. What would it look like to finally live a life built on truth with him beside her, instead of always bracing for the moment he disappeared? 1 year later, their Christmas tree leaned slightly to the left, and neither of them bothered fixing it. Helen stood in the living room, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, watching the soft white lights blink against branches that drooped in all the wrong places. Jonathan insisted it gave the tree character, though she suspected he simply liked the way she laughed whenever she walked by it. Their small craftsman home had a glow to it. Warm lamplight pooled across the hardwood floors, throwing gentle shadows that swayed whenever the furnace clicked on. Outside, Seattle's early evening wrapped the neighborhood in a misty calm. The world felt smaller here, safer, kinder, a place where they didn't have to pretend to be anything but themselves. Jonathan moved slowly as he carried a box of ornaments toward her, his steps more measured these days. He wasn't fragile, not physically. He still carried himself with that quiet precision, that intentional steadiness. But the sharp edges had softened. The distance in his eyes, the tightness in his jaw, the way he used to speak as if bracing for impact, all of it had dissolved into a gentler way of being. "Do you like it?" he asked, nodding toward the tree. His voice was lower now, not from strain, but from comfort, a tone he used only with her. "I do," Helen said, smiling. "It looks like it's trying its best." He laughed, an unguarded sound that still surprised her sometimes. "Kind of like us that first Christmas." She nudged him lightly. "We were leaning a lot farther than this tree." "True." His gaze softened. "And I'm grateful every day we didn't fall." He set the ornament box on the coffee table, then slipped an arm around her waist, guiding her gently to the sofa. She sat carefully, adjusting to the weight she carried, and he lowered himself beside her, as though the moment itself were something he didn't want to disturb. Outside, a light rain tapped against the windows, familiar, steady, the sound that had witnessed their beginning. Helen rested her hands on her belly. "She's been kicking all afternoon," she murmured. "I think she knows it's Christmas." Jonathan's expression shifted into something almost reverent. He lowered his hand, placing it beside hers, waiting. A small thump pressed back against his palm. His breath caught just a little, and then he smiled, a soft, awestruck curve she had seen only a few times. "I still can't believe this," he said quietly. "Us, this house, her." Helen leaned her head against his shoulder. "I can, maybe not at first. But now, it feels like the only thing that ever made sense." They sat like that for a while, the quiet wrapping around them like a blanket. The tree lights flickered, reflecting off the window. Voices drifted from a house down the street, distant and cheerful. The world felt full yet gently hushed. Then the doorbell rang. Jonathan looked toward the entryway, surprise flickering across his face. "Are we expecting someone?" Helen shook her head. "Not that I know of." He rose, straightening unconsciously, old habits of caution settling briefly in his posture. Helen watched him walk to the door, heard the soft click of the lock turning. When he opened it, the porch light illuminated a figure she hadn't seen in months. Eleanor Hale stood there, wrapped in a pale wool coat, hair pinned neatly, her posture as composed as always. But something had changed. Her expression carried no judgment, no icy scrutiny, only hesitation and something like hope. "Helen," she said quietly, her gaze sliding past Jonathan to the living room. "May I come in?" Helen felt a small jolt of nerves, but she nodded. "Of course, please." Jonathan stepped aside. Eleanor entered with slow grace, wiping a few raindrops from her coat sleeve. She looked around, taking in the home, the warm clutter of books, the slightly crooked tree, the pair of mugs cooling on the table. Her eyes softened. "This is lovely," she murmured. "Warm, lived in." "Thank you," Helen said, unsure what else to add. Eleanor reached into her handbag and pulled out a carefully folded bundle of soft fabric. Pale blue, worn at the edges, held together with decades of tenderness. "I brought something," she said, her voice catching slightly. "Jonathan wore this when he was born. I kept it all these years. I thought—" She looked at Helen, then at her son. "I thought your child should have it." Jonathan stilled. "Mother, I wasn't kind," she continued, her tone trembling but steady. "I judged what I didn't understand. I pushed you toward perfection because it was the only way I knew to keep you safe. And in doing so, I hurt both of you." Helen's breath hitched at the sincerity in the woman's voice. Eleanor stepped closer and held out the blanket with both hands. "I would be honored if your daughter wore it home from the hospital." Helen touched the fabric lightly, feeling the softness of something cared for over a lifetime. She swallowed. "Thank you," she whispered. "It means more than you know." Jonathan moved beside her, placing his hand gently on Helen's back. He looked at his mother with an expression she hadn't seen on him since childhood. Photos, cautious, hopeful, yearning. Eleanor reached out and placed a hand over theirs. The three stood there, hands joined over the tiny blanket as if holding a piece of history together and rewriting it at the same time. Helen felt something inside her shift, a healing she hadn't expected, a connection forming across years of distance and frost, a family line beginning to thaw. Eleanor inhaled shakily. "I lost the chance to make things right with many people. I don't want to lose it with you." Jonathan blinked back emotion. "Neither do I." Their hands tightened slightly, a gentle embrace not of bodies but of hearts. Quiet, healing, real. Helen leaned her head against Jonathan's shoulder. The living room glowed softly around them. The tree leaned left. The rain kept falling. And somehow, everything felt exactly as it should be. Yet beneath the warmth, one small question settled in Helen's chest, not out of fear, but love. How would they protect this fragile, beautiful life they were building, so they never came close to losing it again? On Christmas Eve, as snow drifted past the window in soft wandering flakes, Helen realized she no longer feared being seen. She sat curled on the sofa, wrapped in one of Jonathan's sweaters, the fire humming quietly in the hearth. The house smelled of pine and cinnamon, the kind of scent that felt like a memory, even while it was still happening. Jonathan moved around the living room with deliberate calm, adding another log to the fire, adjusting the blanket over the back of the armchair, checking that the stockings, slightly crooked, still hung where she'd placed them. He had always been precise, but over the past year that precision had shifted from armor to care. There was gentleness in the way he touched their home now, as if it were a living thing. Helen watched him from the sofa, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, feeling the soft roll of movement beneath her palm. Their daughter had become more active in the evenings, nudging as though insisting she already had something to say. Helen smiled faintly. Jonathan noticed. "Is she kicking again?" "Yes," Helen murmured. "She seems to like the sound of the fire." He settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed his warmth, folding into hers. For a moment they simply watched the flames together, their breaths sinking in a slow, steady rhythm. The snow outside thickened, gathering along the windowsill. Christmas lights from the neighboring houses cast small halos on the white lawn. Everything felt still, wrapped in a hush that made even their thoughts seem softer. Helen spoke first. "Do you ever think about who we were before all this?" Jonathan exhaled, long and pensive. "Every day." She turned her head toward him. His face glowed in the firelight, the shifting orange brushing against the lines near his eyes, lines that had grown gentler since he'd let himself smile more. "I used to be afraid of what you would see," she said. "Afraid of being too plain, too quiet, too ordinary for someone like you." "You were never ordinary," he whispered. "But that's how I felt," she continued, her voice steady, honest. "I spent years making myself small, so I wouldn't disappoint anyone. Even when I said yes to your offer, I did it because I was drowning and too tired to fight anymore." Jonathan nodded slowly, taking in every word. "I know I took advantage of that moment. I didn't mean to. I was just afraid," she finished for him. He looked down at his hands, clasped loosely between his knees. "Yes, afraid of needing someone, afraid of losing again, before I even began." The fire cracked, sending a small spark upward. The room glowed with shifting light. Jonathan's voice softened. "I built my whole life around avoiding hurt, and yet the moment you walked into it, everything I'd built felt hollow." He swallowed. "You didn't do anything dramatic. You were just kind, just present. And that terrified me in ways I didn't know how to name." Helen reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. His thumb brushed her knuckles, as if remembering the first time he had dared to hold her at all. "I used to think love meant performing," he admitted quietly. "Being perfect, being everything someone wanted so they wouldn't leave." He paused. "My mother taught me that without meaning to. So did my past. I thought if I slipped even once, I'd lose everything." Helen tightened her grip. "But you didn't lose me because you slipped. You almost lost me because you wouldn't let yourself be human." Jonathan looked up at her then, his eyes reflecting the firelight, warm, steady, and painfully sincere. "I know." They sat with that truth between them, the kind that didn't sting anymore but healed. Helen shifted slightly to face him, her voice softer. What do you want our daughter to grow up believing? Jonathan didn't hesitate. That she never has to earn love. That she never has to be perfect to deserve it. That she is safe, even on the days she's unsure. Helen felt her throat tighten, a wave of tenderness rising inside her. And what about us? He looked at her, really looked, with the depth of someone who had learned how to love by nearly losing it. For us, he said, I want honesty, not performance. If I'm afraid, I'll say it. If you're hurting, I want to know. I don't want to hide behind rules again, not from you. Not from our family. Her breath trembled. I want that too. The fire snapped and shifted, sending a warm glow across their faces. Jonathan turned fully toward her, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The gesture was simple, intimate, in a way that had grown profound over time. Helen, he murmured, voice low and steady, I didn't choose you because you were convenient. I chose you because you were the first place that ever felt like home. Those words settled deep in her, warm and certain. She leaned her forehead against his, closing her eyes for a moment as his hands held hers gently, carefully, reverently. Outside, the snow continued falling, soft and relentless. Inside, the fire glowed brighter, warming the living room, wrapping their small family in a quiet cocoon of peace. Helen inhaled the scent of pine, felt the flutter beneath her ribs, heard Jonathan's steady breathing beside her. This was a life they had almost missed, a life born from a lie shaped by fear and finally made real by choosing each other without conditions. She opened her eyes and looked at the man who had once asked her to pretend. And she wondered, not with regret but with a quiet ache, what would any of their lives have looked like if they had allowed love in sooner? Sometimes, healing begins in the quiet places. We never meant to step into a borrowed moment, a stranger's kindness, a choice we didn't know. We were brave enough to make. Life has a way of pulling us toward the very things we once feared, not to punish us, but to show us what our hearts were still capable of. What Jonathan and Helen reminded us is that love doesn't always arrive dressed as certainty. Sometimes it comes as a small, steady presence, someone who sees the part of us we've hidden for years and doesn't turn away. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do, especially after a lifetime of holding ourselves together, is to let ourselves be known. Maybe that's the quiet miracle of second chances. They don't erase the past, but they soften it. They give us room to breathe, to forgive ourselves, and to believe that tenderness isn't something we outgrow with age. If you're listening with a heart that's tired or tender tonight, I hope you remember this. It's never too late to choose the kind of love that feels like coming home. Thank you truly for spending your time with this story. Your presence here, your quiet attention, means more than you know. If the journey touched something in you, a simple like share or subscribe helps these gentle stories find others who might need them too. Wishing you warmth, peace, and a soft place to rest your heart tonight.